Hello, this is Dr. Martell, and if all goes according to plan, this will be the second of two lectures on Pragmatism and William James. This lecture will deal first with James' treatment of a couple of what he calls metaphysical disputes. And then I'll turn to probably the most controversial aspect of James's philosophy, and that's his rendition of the pragmatist theory of truth. And so I'm mainly going to be focusing on from his lectures on pragmatism, the third lecture and the sixth lecture. So in lecture 3, James begins to deliver on what he promised his audience in lecture 1. And he promised his audience that pragmatism would allow them to address, to their satisfaction, this what I call a cultural crisis of the late 19th century and early 20th century. In James's terminology, this crisis involves a conflict between people of two different temperaments, the tough-minded and the tender-minded. I presented this as a conflict between what I called scientifically minded people and religiously minded people. In lecture 3, right, when James is using pragmatism to address these so-called metaphysical disputes, he means to be in various ways addressing that conflict and attempting to achieve something like a resolution or dissolution of that conflict. I'm not going to deal with all of the metaphysical disputes. I'm going to just focus on, I think, two of the most interesting for our purposes. First off, the metaphysical dispute between materialism and idealism, and then the metaphysical dispute between what James calls free willism, which I would prefer to call voluntarism, and determinism. But first, a few words in review about metaphysical disputes. I left off last lecture saying a bit about how James uses that terminology. So philosophers have unfortunately used the word metaphysics in a number of different ways. I think the dominant use, though, is the one that I initially presented you with, and that's an account of the fundamental nature of reality. Okay, that's metaphysics in philosophy for the most part. Okay, by James's time, traditional metaphysical positions and also a number of disputes about metaphysical matters in philosophy had come to look to many people as unscientific disputes. And so James himself tends to use the word metaphysics or metaphysical dispute, that phrase, in a special way. He means disputes, apparently about the fundamental nature of reality, that do not seem to be resolvable by appeal to what was then understood as scientific method, or we should really say, since there is no one scientific method, scientific methods. Okay, right, and so, right, given the esteem in which many people held the sciences at that time, it looked to many people like these disputes were just not resolvable. Like if we can't resolve them by appeal to science, then we can't resolve them at all. And so those are metaphysical disputes in James's sense. And the two that I want to focus on are this dispute between the materialists and idealists, and the dispute between determinists and voluntarists. Okay. When discussing Descartes' philosophy, I there presented you with more or less definitions of materialism and idealism. And those definitions are accurate as far as 17th and really 18th century philosophy are concerned. Like in Descartes' day, a materialist would be someone who believed that everything that is body, right? And idealists, if not in Descartes' day, then not too long after, are people who would have denied that there is anything other than minds and their ideas, right? So that's materialism and idealism in what's called modern philosophies, like 17th and 18th century European philosophy. Okay, James uses these terms though, like more broadly. Okay, so the people that I've called materialists, as I've defined materialism, they would certainly count as materialists in James's sense, and the people that I've called idealists, right, when talking about those 17th and 18th century figures, James would certainly also count them as idealists, but if you think of his terms materialism and idealism as kind of like nets, he's casting a wider net in both cases, right? Like more people are going to count as materialists than just people who thought in the 17th century that everything is body, right? In Descartes' sense, it's like extended stuff that occupies space, and more people are going to count as idealists than just those rather strange figures who thought that there are only minds and ideas. Okay, what does James mean by an idealist? Let's start there. Well, like we know this is one characteristic of what he calls like a tender-minded person, right? But like, what else is involved with being an advocate of idealism? The idealist, according to James, is someone who thinks that the world comes in levels. They at least talk this way. So that there are things that are said to be like higher things and things that are lower things. Okay? And their view is, the idealist view is, that the higher explains the lower. Okay? So what would count as higher? Well, actually, given James's understanding of and given his use of the term idealism, Augustine would actually be an excellent example of an idealist, right? Recall from Augustine's proof for the existence of God, that very strange proof, that Augustine more or less just assumed that the cosmos involves like levels of things, right? Like on the lowest level, there's inorganic, inanimate stuff, right? The next level above that, there's living stuff, or living things, right? The next level above that, there's so-called rational life, right? So beings with minds, beings with the capacity to reason, such as human beings, right? Above that would be like, I guess like mathematical and geometrical entities, right? Maybe also like something like Plato's forms. And then above that, at the very top, there's the one, unity itself, and also goodness itself, and that's God. Okay, God in this scheme explains absolutely everything else that there is. So its highest explains everything else that there is. It explains the fact that there is anything else. God, we appeal to God in order to explain the fact that there are certain kinds of things and not others. God also, right, accounts for whatever purposes everything else that exists, like ultimately serves. So God is Augustine's like ultimate explanatory principle in this scheme that involves like levels of reality. This scheme that I've called on occasion the great chain of being. Plato, of course, would also be an idealist in this sense, and Plato is, actually often so characterized because those entities, which I've called the forms, Um, uh, they, they are also sometimes called, rather confusingly, ideas. Ideas. So the form of justice, which is the form that Republic was principally about, that form is sometimes called in translation, right? The idea of justice. Of course, right? The forms or the ideas, they figure in a scheme in Plato's philosophy, on which some things are better than other things, right? They're even higher than other things, like literally, like on the divided line, they're higher. And in the allegory of the cave, right? In the allegory, like they're higher up. I mean, the forms are the sun and the moon and the stars, right? Those things that are supposed to be higher, they're also explanatory, according to Plato. Formed beings belonging to the visible world, the beings that we can sense, the beings that most of us take as real in and of themselves, as independently real. Those things, right, only exist according to Plato due to the fact that they participate in, exemplify insensible forms, okay, or ideas. The forms, right, those are independently existing things on which everything that we sense in the visible world depends. And so the forms are explanatory, and the forms are higher things. Descartes, of course, right, even though he does not think that they're only minds and ideas, he thinks that they're bodies too. So the human being is a composite being, mind and body. Descartes would also count as an idealist in this broad sense of idealism that James employs. Because Descartes does believe that at least some of what happens in the physical world is explained by minds. Okay, and never mind the fact that Descartes also thinks that there is a God. This God is more or less the God of Christianity, and so this God like actually creates all the finite beings, including like all the bodies that there are, and like all the finite minds, like your mind and my mind. Too. Setting aside that, Descartes thinks that actually much of what happens in the physical world is due to finite minds. As when you choose to move part of your body, like raise your right hand, right, and do so. Okay, this is an example of mind-body interaction. This is an example of a change of the state in your mind, according to Descartes, causing a change in the state of your body. And so this is an example, to speak sort of along James's lines, speak like James, this is an example of what Descartes pretty clearly regarded as something higher, the mind, your mind, explaining something that happens in a lower realm, in the realm of body. Okay, so that's idealism, right? In James's sense, there are higher things and there are lower things, and the higher, right, explains the lower. So what does he mean by materialism? That now that I've explained what idealism is in his sense, it's really easy to account for materialism in his sense. Materialism is the view that the so-called higher, it's explained by the lower. Okay, so how does this go? Like concretely, like what's an example of like a materialist view in this again, like broad sense of materialism? And actually, like we've encountered a materialist view really early in the course when dealing with first Thrasymachus and his definition of justice, and then Glaucon's case for injustice. on Thrasymachus's view, I mean, that idea of justice, it's an invention of basically like powerful people, strong people. Um, they create rules that serve their interests, right? They call obeying those rules right. They call disobeying those rules wrong. The rules altogether that are right to obey, yeah, that's justice. And injustice is basically any violation of those rules. Glaucon gave a somewhat different account of how it is that human beings create the idea of justice. His view was that but before there were notions of right and wrong and just and unjust, people could do like whatever they wanted. They found that there were benefits to this, and they found that there were costs to this. And over time, they found that the costs far exceeded the benefits, and so they agreed to the terms of something like a peace treaty, terms on which some actions would hitherto be out of bounds, right? No one could do those things. And so doing those things, that they called wrong. Playing by these rules, right, keeping to the terms of this kind of peace treaty, that's right. The right stuff altogether, that's justice. The wrong things altogether, that's injustice. So to put it in sort of more contemporary parlance, that view, which is that was a sophist view, right, among the ancient Greeks. Here that Plato was expressing by way of those characters, Thrasymachus and Glaucon. To speak in more contemporary terms, we could say that justice is, and all of morality, it's just a social construct. That's all it is. And people will vary. People who say this, materialists in James's sense, who say this, their accounts will vary in detail. I mean, some will take the Thrasymachus line and basically argue that it's a social construct by which some people will just exploit other people and take advantage of other people. So it's all about the power of one group being used to dominate another group. Justice is simply and morality is just an extension of their power. It just perpetuates their power. It's an instrument of domination of other people, or right like other people, particularly impressed by evolutionary biology. I mean, those people will say that this is a social construct that was invented to produce beneficial consequences for society as a whole, and on balance, it has those consequences, and this helps to explain why it has been basically perpetuated, right, since its invention. It accounts for why over time most all human societies have very similar conceptions of what justice is. In any case, that's a materialist view. Okay, here's another materialist view. This mental process of inventing the idea of justice and then choosing to do things to put it into practice, perpetuate those practices. These mental processes, they would have been called, they are called higher by present day idealists. These so-called higher things, those mental processes, those are just physical processes, according to materialists. Those are just neurological processes, which are ultimately biological processes, and biological processes are ultimately just chemical processes, which are of course a subset of physical processes, right? Thinking is just something that brains do, and brains are just like organic stuff, and like everything organic, that's just chemical processes, physical processes. The so-called higher beings, human beings, right, that exhibit these processes, these mental processes. those higher beings, like are physical, according to materialists, like through and through, and originated not through any act or choice of like a divine mind, like the mind of God. We originated through like impersonal physical processes, much like those described by evolutionary biologists, starting with Darwin, right? So, what about living things generally? Well, I mean, the materialist account of this issue is a little bit murky even today. But I mean, materialists, I think, like surely, like eventually, will find like what impersonal physical processes, right, gave rise to living physical things generally. Okay, so hopefully, though, you like vague as that last part may be, you get the drift here, right? The idealist is someone who thinks there are levels to reality, and they have a top-down view of what goes on in like the real world as a whole. The higher explains the lower, right? Materialists, on the other hand, right, strictly speaking, is not willing to talk about like higher and lower. Sorry, is not willing to grant that there's higher and lower, right? What they're going to say is, yeah, what you idealists call the higher, it's not really higher, but what you call the higher, yeah. If that exists at all, it's explained by what you regard as the lower, okay? Physical stuff, like impersonal physical processes that are governed by natural laws. Okay. So this is one point in the dispute between the tender-minded and the tough-minded, right? The tender-minded typically being idealists, and the tough-minded typically being materialists. And so James wants to use the pragmatist method to try and resolve or dissolve this dispute. Either like show that one party is right and the other one is wrong, point the way to like a decisive test, right, whereby we could establish who is right and who is wrong, or maybe show that this problem, right, of which is true, idealism or materialism, maybe show that it's a pseudo problem, it's a fake problem. Okay, that's generally how things go when we apply pragmatism to a dispute. We apply pragmatism by trying to get clear on meanings of terms in which the problem is expressed. Okay, so what we should like to do then is sort of appeal to the pragmatist theory of meaning in order to clarify, right, what's meant by materialism, idealism. And of course, we clarify terms or ideas, to speak more like James and Peirce, we clarify these terms or ideas by trying to get clear on their practical consequences, right? Like how would you expect things to go, right, if the term applies? Okay, so let's start with materialism, right? Like how would you expect things to go as you act in the world if that term applies? Let's start with, right, what you would expect to find if you were to investigate the past, right? Like human history, but like geological history in general, even like the whole history of the cosmos, right? If materialism is true, what would you expect to find? And I think what you would expect to find would be like physical things of various kinds, some of which are composed out of others, right? Regular physical processes, so happenings involving those things, which exhibit like repeated patterns, right? Patterns that are repeated such that it is possible to discover, right, laws, right? Basically rules, hard and fast rules, by which these processes unfold. Okay, so in short, what you would expect to find as you investigate the past of all of this is like physical stuff, right, and the natural laws. Those are impersonal laws, right? Like force equals mass times acceleration. There's an example. Physical stuff, right, and the natural laws governing processes involving that stuff. That's what you would expect to find. Okay. Now, what does the idealist expect to find in contrast? Okay. If idealism is true, right, how would you expect your experience to go when you investigate the past? Okay, now here's what James wants to say. In principle, right, the idealist is not committed to finding, when investigating the past, anything different than what the materialist is committed to finding, right? The idealist can grant, right, the materialists every discovery that the materialist makes, asserts concerning the past. The idealist can grant that there have been like these physical things governed by the same natural laws that the materialist thinks governs physical things and processes involving those things. Okay, the idealist can grant all of that. The idealist doesn't have to deny any of that. Okay, the idealist, in principle, though, like just has to add one thing, right? What they have to add is this: something higher somehow accounts for, somehow explains, right, the fact that there are those physical things, and the fact that they are governed by those natural laws. Okay, and so like, you know, one example, right, of what an idealist might add to a materialist account of the past. One example would be, the fact that there are these physical things and that they are involved in these processes, like for instance, like the evolutionary process, that's due to acts of God, right? God thought of this possible world, right, and chose to create it, and made sure in creating it that just the right circumstances would occur at some point in the history of the cosmos, such that life would emerge and evolution would ensue and would eventually issue in human beings. Okay, so that's the one thing or kind of thing that an idealist would have to add, like, to be an idealist, to what materialists want to say about the past. Are idealists ever committed, though, right, to finding, right, in their investigation of the past, any evidence of this, or to put it differently, are they committed when investigating the past to any expectations regarding what they're going to find eventually, right, that are different than what a materialist expects to find? Like I don't know. Like an example would be as you investigate the past, right? Something like God's signature somewhere to the effect, I did this, right? Idealists aren't, James wants to say, committed to any such thing, And so at this point in James's treatment of this dispute, it looks like what he's saying is that the idealist really doesn't have a different idea, right, about how things are than the materialists. It looks like this way because he seems to be saying that the idealist is in principle not committed to discovering anything about the past in the course of investigation different than what the materialist could discover. Okay, if the idealist is not committed to any different expectations about how experience is going to go than the materialist, then this would be an example of a merely verbal dispute, and so it would be an example of a pseudo problem, not a real problem, right? The two parties to this dispute would simply be using different terms to talk about like the very same state of affairs. Okay. James, however, does not regard this as a verbal dispute. He does not regard it as a verbal dispute because he thinks that the parties to this dispute, right, materialists on the one hand, idealists on the other, don't just have expectations about how investigation will go when we sort of inquire about the past. Okay, both materialists and idealists also have expectations where the future is concerned. Okay, not just future inquiry regarding the past, right? But like the future generally. Like they have two, in his view, quite different views about how things are going to go. Okay, and so in James's view, this is in fact a substantive dispute. The practical difference does not have to do with the past. Okay, and so it's not by doing like some kind of like cosmological inquiry or evolutionary biology or something or human history that we're going to like resolve this dispute, right? The practical difference has to do with the future. Okay, so let me start out with like how idealists expect the future to go. Okay, as people who embrace the idea of idealism, right? Like they have certain expectations regarding how things are going to go in the future generally. Okay, how? Again, like idealists differ on details, right? But all of them are committed, James wants to say, to a view that he expresses as follows. Our highest ideals as human beings will ultimately be realized somewhere at some time in the future. Okay, like what are some of these highest ideals? Well, like one such ideal is justice. I relatively recently was driving like around kind of the North Portland area, and I got off on the Greeley Street exit going I think northbound on I-5, and there's some graffiti there, and it says like strike for a moral world. and I thought, good luck with that, because that's a very tall order, right? A moral world. If morality is more encompassing than justice, then a just world would be not so tall an order, but still a very tall order. We're unlikely to see that sort of thing in our lifetimes, right? Try as we might to realize it. Right? Again, it's like it's an extremely tall order. Realizing this ideal in our world. Okay. Here's what the idealist is committed to. Someday it will be realized. Okay. It will probably not be within our lifetimes. It may be in thousands or tens of thousands of years. It might not be through human efforts alone. It may require divine assist, right? But sometime, someplace, right? These ideals, like the ideal of justice that we try and realize, it will be realized. Okay, that's what the idealist is committed to, where the future is concerned, and this helps to explain why James regards the tender-minded person, who's also an idealist, as optimistic, right? I mean, if you think about like the story of the the history of the cosmos, right, as like a story, right? Their view is that the story has a happy ending, right? The ideals for which people struggle, those ideals will ultimately be realized. Okay, it may take thousands of years, but it will happen. Okay. Recall that he regarded, though, the tough-minded person as not an optimist at all, but like a pessimist. Okay, so what does the materialist think about the future that justifies calling this sort of person like a pessimistic person? Well, I could go point by point through those examples of materialism, right? Those examples where like supposedly the higher is explained by what's said to be lower. But I'll just make this one. I'll just give this one example to try and make the point here. I think in cosmology, so like the study of the cosmos as a whole, right? I think that at one time it was believed, on the part of like cutting edge scientists in this field, that the universe, of course, like began with like a big bang. So it sort of emerges, it sort of explodes actually from an infinitesimally small point into, right, this vast, right, rapidly expanding space. Their view was it expands and expands and expands, right, for millennia. Until eventually, the energy driving expansion is used up, right? Other forces then come into play. I think principally like the force of gravity. And what happens then is that the stuff the cosmos is composed of, like, gradually then begins to come back together, right? And so what happens is that the universe gradually like collapses and collapses and collapses until at the end, right, it collapses back into, right, that infinitesimally small point from which it began. And they called this, as you might have guessed, this supposed future event, they called it the Big Crunch. So it starts with a bang and ends, the cosmos, it starts with a bang and ends with a crunch. Okay. What happens to us and our ideals and the memory of our struggles to achieve them and whatever progress we made to achieve them? Here's what happens. It's all as if none of it ever occurred. There's nothing left of it. Not even the memory of it. Right, like maybe after the big crunch, there's another big bang, and the whole process starts over again. But what we do, right, what we have done, like, it makes absolutely no difference to any of that. And even if there is another process, big bang, big crunch, like after this one, right, it surely would be followed by like a big crunch too, right? It's all for nothing in the end. That theory, this theory that the universe will collapse in on itself, ending in a big crunch, I think that theory is now not a popular theory, because there's actually considerable evidence that the universe is continuing to expand, and is actually expanding at an increasing rate. So the expansion is actually like accelerating. And apparently it's hard to explain on the basis of like known matter and energy, like why observable matter and energy, like why why this is happening, and that's one of the justifications, my understanding anyway, for thinking there is this stuff called, like, I think like dark matter, and I think there's like talk of dark energy too. Be that as it may, like the new, I think, widely accepted view is that this expansion will just go on and on and on and on and on. And eventually this will result in there being really no more galaxies. Because everything will be like so far apart, right, that it no longer makes sense to call this stuff like part of the same system. And there will be no more like solar systems like ours, right? And there won't be planets either. Because like as the universe expands, like all matter will come to be like further and further and further apart from other matter. There won't even be stars, right? There will just be like, atoms, right? Individual ones, like extremely far away, like from any other matter, right? So no galaxies, no solar system, no stars, no life, and no light either, right? Just this infinite, dark expanse forever. Well, that's something to look forward to, and like what will become of all of our struggles and accomplishments and hopes and dreams and our ideals, right? At that point in the distant future, right? Well, I mean, it'll all be as if none of it had ever occurred, right? There won't be any trace of it left, like let alone like any memory of it. No lasting accomplishment at all, right? That's a very pessimistic view, right? So this is a substantive dispute. Substantive disputes, pragmatists think that they're possible to settle by appeal to experience. They're possible to settle by way of a test. Okay, that's true generally. It's true in this case as well. This is a substantive dispute that could be settled by experience. What experience? Well, see how things turn out, right? Like at the end of time, have our highest ideals been realized or have they not? Okay, there you go. Right, so it's a substantive dispute. It's a dispute such that there's a test whereby we can resolve the dispute. And I think James also wants to say, we are not in a position to conduct that test. Right? And none of us will ever be in that position in our lifetimes. Okay. And so, right, one further consequence here of James's analysis, it turns out that both idealism and materialism are matters of faith. I mean, after all, like a matter of faith, that's a belief that you have, right? Regardless of the fact that you don't have like adequate justification for it, right? Right. The decisive test where idealism versus materialism is concerned has not been performed, and it will never be performed in any of our lifetimes. Okay. If people nonetheless believe one or the other, idealism or materialism, then they're believing regardless of the fact that they lack sufficient evidence. Okay. Those are matters of faith. And I think this is an interesting conclusion, really, because while it's not surprising to hear that tender-minded people, people who are religious, right, people who are idealists in James's sense, are people of faith, while that's not unusual, it's very unusual, right, to hear tough-minded, supposedly scientific people, right? Scientifically minded people. It's very rare to hear them described as people of faith, right? Those people themselves, right, typically present themselves as being like where their beliefs are concerned, right? Evidence-based. They just follow the science, right? Some of them even regard like faith as like a dangerous thing, particularly religious faith. A thing that human beings could very well do without. Okay, James's view is nonetheless, right, they too are committed to a belief for which they have insufficient evidence. They too are people who are people of faith, right? A pessimistic faith, right? A very bleak faith in comparison with the idealist. All right, so how does this help resolve, right, this cultural crisis? How does it help us address this crisis involving conflict between like science and religion? It basically helps us resolve the conflict by allowing us to see that we can perfectly, responsibly, rationally be religious people of a certain kind, right? While also respecting scientific achievements too, valuing them and valuing to like scientific methods. There isn't really an incompatibility between science and a certain kind of religious outlook. Okay, so let me turn to the second metaphysical dispute that I want to deal with, and that's the dispute between determinists and voluntarists, aka, following James, free willists. So, tough-minded people again tend to be determinists, right? This actually follows from their materialism pretty readily. A determinist is someone who thinks that absolutely every event is causally necessitated by the past and the laws of nature. So holding the past constant and the laws of nature constant, everything that happens must happen, right? There was no possibility of anything else happening, right? This holds for events generally, according to determinists. So not just events involving, like rocks and water, but also events involving human beings, like all of them, okay? So if at some point, like you were to decide to get married and did so, right? Their view would be that event, that would just as surely be causally necessitated by the past and the laws of nature as water freezing when you put it in a freezer, such that the freezer is like well below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Just as that has to happen, the water has to turn to ice, right? Given the past and the laws of nature. So, given, like your upbringing or something like that, and like the kinds of like relationships you tend to form based upon your relationship with your parents, it's some kind of story like that. You had at that moment, right, when you chose to get married, you had to make that choice. There was really nothing else possible. Okay. The free willist or voluntarist, right, has a different view. Their view is that for at least some things that human beings do, they could have done otherwise. Okay. So among the philosophers that we've been dealing with this semester, Descartes is clearly a voluntarist, right? He says so in Meditation 4. As I summed up that meditation for you, he's more or less there adopting Augustine's views on free will. Augustine is clearly a voluntarist or a free willist. After all, like one of the things that human beings do, according to Augustine, and just us generally, is choose. Choosing is doing, right? Choice is an exercise of this power of will that human beings have, and our will is a self-determining power, right? Nothing outside of our will makes our will the way it is. So however you determine your will, however you exercise this power, however you choose, you certainly could have chosen otherwise, according to Augustine. Right? Okay, let's apply pragmatism to this issue, to this dispute too. And we're going to do this by, again, trying to get clear on the terms in which the dispute is couched. Okay, determinism, free will. Okay, we'll start with determinism. Okay, and again, James first focuses on what you could expect to find as you investigate the past if determinism is true. Okay, so he first confines his attention to the past, right? When thinking about the practical consequences of that doctrine, determinism, right? What does it tell us about what we'll find when we investigate the past? And what it tells us is that we'll find events which exhibit regular patterns, such that it is possible to discover rules, right, which hold without exception for these like patterns of event. Okay. Basically, what I'm getting at here is that when we investigate the past, we'll discover happenings, right, that could possibly be governed by natural laws. Okay, and natural laws, let's just say those are like deterministic laws. They're laws saying what has to happen, right, given what already has happened. Okay. So that's what the determinist expects to find when investigating the past. What, by contrast, does the voluntarist expect to find when investigating the past? James wants to say, in principle, the voluntarist doesn't expect to find anything different, right? Whatever the determinist discovers when investigating the past, right? The voluntarist can admit, yeah, I mean these events in the past happened, including events involving human beings. And yes, nothing seems to rule out those events being governed by deterministic natural laws. Okay, the idealist would only add one thing, and that's that whatever happened in the past, however regular, right, it might appear to us to have been, sometimes when the happening involves human beings, things might have gone otherwise, because human beings could have done otherwise, right? Specifically, they could have chosen to do other things than they did. Okay, of course, when we investigate the past, we can't actually discover this, right? Because when we investigate the past, we only find out what actually happened, right? We never find, when we investigate the past, what might have happened but didn't, because after all, it didn't happen. So once again, it appears as though this dispute between determinists and voluntarists is a verbal dispute, actually. It looks as though these are two different ways of talking about exactly the same state of affairs. It doesn't look like there is any practical difference between these two doctrines. But that's only if we confine our attention to what these doctrines tell us about the past. Okay, James wants to say that if we turn our attention to the future, right, we'll find that these two ideas are actually very, very different. Okay, so I'm going to this time go ahead and start with determinism and what it leads us to expect where the future generally is concerned, and not just future investigation of the past. Okay, what does the determinist expect? James's answer is more of the same. right. I mean, after all, the determinist is someone who thinks that, all right, everything that happens basically happens according to natural law. Natural law is always the same, right? That's kind of what it is for a law to be like a natural one, right? It doesn't come and go, right? For a time, and it's constant. So the determinist is someone who thinks then that the future is going to unfold basically like the past. It's not going to be any different. It's going to be like more of the same. More of the same. Okay. What, by contrast, does the voluntarist expect? James's view is that the voluntarist expects something new to happen. Okay. Specifically, right? The voluntarist does not think that human beings in particular have to keep behaving in the same way that we have apparently like consistently been behaving like for as long as we have been around, or for at least as long as we have been like recording our own history. Okay. Like unfortunate things that we have done, right? Like unjust things that we have done. We do not have to keep doing those things, right? Like it is possible for us to change, right? In general, in the future, it is possible for through choice, right, something genuinely new to emerge, something that is not just like more of the same as what has already occurred, right? So this is actually a substantive dispute. It's not a merely verbal dispute, right? As with substantive disputes, generally, they're testable. There's an experience or experiences which could be appealed to decide the issue of who is right. The determinist, right, whose view is, so has it been, so shall it ever be, right? Or the voluntarist, who says, like, regardless of how it has been, right, something new in the future will emerge. Okay. That test, though, is rather like the test that would decide the issue between materialists and idealists. Okay. At what point in the future is the voluntarist committed to the new emerging? At no particular point. Right? So the only way to actually really like decide this issue between the voluntarist and the determinist would be to be on hand at basically the end of time and look and see, okay, right, was it all like the same? Or at some point did something like new emerge? Okay. In short, there is, again, a test, but we are never going to be in a position to conduct that test. And so once again, James wants to say, we've got a substantive dispute here between people who have beliefs for which they have insufficient evidence. This is a substantive dispute currently between people of two different faiths. Right? Voluntarism, that's a faith. Okay. But determinism, the supposedly tough-minded, like scientifically minded view, that, according to James, is an article of faith too. Okay. And so once again, right? I mean, this provides a kind of opening to people who like want their science and their religion too. Respecting science, right, doesn't imply, right, accepting every article of faith that like champions of science happen to have, right? Again, like we might admire scientific accomplishments, right? We might regard this like scientific methods as immensely valuable for like extending our knowledge of certain matters, and still, right, refuse to accept as an article of faith, you know what, future's going to be pretty much exactly like the past. Same stuff, involved in exactly the same processes, governed by exactly the same natural laws. Nothing new and better, right, is ever going to emerge. Okay, one last thing about James's treatment of these disputes. Okay, While James thinks it is possible to kind of like, again, like have respect for science and be an idealist, and more than an idealist, also a voluntarist, he does not, as a matter of fact, think it makes sense to be just any kind of idealist if you are also a voluntarist. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at here is that he does place kind of like rational constraints on that article of faith, idealism, right? He thinks that you can be a rational person, right, and believe things, right, regardless of the fact that you don't have sufficient evidence for those things. But he does not think, right, that you really can be like a very rational person and be committed to like articles of faith that fly in the face, right, of evidence to the contrary, or be a rational person who's also committed to articles of faith that are like inconsistent or incompatible with each other, like logically inconsistent. So let me go into the details here of what he wants to say about idealism and voluntarism, those two articles of faith, to try and make this more clear. Look, why James wonders would someone like adopt as an article of faith this view that in the future something genuinely new is going to occur. It's just going to be like more of the same, a repetition of the past. I mean, surely someone is committed to that view because they wish for a better world, right? I mean, if you thought that the world was already like as good as it could possibly be, like this was the best of all possible worlds, then why on earth would you be interested at all in anything new emerging? I mean, if you think about it, you wouldn't want anything genuinely new to emerge. You would want like more of the same. After all, right? You think this is the best of all possible worlds. Yeah, give me more of that. Right? So, if you're someone who is a voluntarist, right? You're someone who, you think that the genuinely new is going to emerge. That's an article of faith for you, right? Moreover, right? You've got to think it's going to be something better than what we've already got. Okay. This means that you do not think that this world is already as good as it possibly can be. Okay. To use more familiar terminology, which I used a few moments ago, if you're a voluntarist, it does not make any sense to think, according to James, that this world already is the best of all possible worlds. Now, this has an important implication for idealism. It rules out idealism of the Augustinian variety, I think James would say. Right? I mean, after all, Augustine is an idealist who's committed to the view that this is the best of all possible worlds. I mean, if this were not the best of all possible worlds, like right now, then Augustine's God would have to be an underachiever. Either Augustine's God would have to lack the power to make the best of all possible worlds, or lack the desire, the will, to make this world as good as it possibly could be, or lack the know-how, like lack the knowledge of how to use, right, omnipotence to bring about the best of all possible worlds that this being of perfectly good will wills. What James is getting at then is the following: what the pragmatist's method has shown, right, about these metaphysical disputes, is that it's possible to be like a person who respects science and respects rationality in general, but it's not possible to be both, right? An idealist of the Augustinian variety, right? Someone who believes in a God with the three O's: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. and be someone who has faith in free will too. You can't have it both ways. You might believe in free will and believe in a God, and indeed like an immensely powerful God, right? Or a God who has like very, very, very great knowledge, okay? Or also a God who has like, immense goodwill, okay? But it is inconsistent to believe in a God who has all the power, all the knowledge, and is a perfectly good will too. Because that God implies that this world is already the best one. The best of all possible worlds needs nothing new to occur. Okay. All right. Let me then go ahead and turn to sort of the last topic that we have in connection with James, and that's the pragmatist theory of truth. Okay. Again, this is the most controversial aspect of James's philosophy. I'm first going to go ahead and state very briefly, more or less verbatim, the theory, and then I'm going to try to explain it like in two parts. Okay. James says, like pretty much verbatim in that lecture, that ideas become true insofar as they help to get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. Okay. So there are two parts there. There's this notion of ideas becoming true, and then there's this notion that ideas, they do a certain job for us, the true ones. They help us to get into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. Okay, I want to deal with that second part first, and then I'll come back to this notion that ideas become true and try and explain by way of an example what James is getting at there. Okay, so I alluded to, or I actually gave you hints about James's theory of truth at the end of the previous lecture. And I did this by noting that for James and pragmatists generally, like ideas are like tools, right? They lead us to have certain expectations about how things are going to go, right? Certainly when we investigate, but also when we act in the world generally. So ideas are kind of like devices that serve to predict. Okay, so they're like tools. To say that an idea is true is to say that an idea is a good idea, right? It's one of the ways of saying kind of like, yeah, that's a good idea. True. Okay, to say that an idea is true then, right, is to say that a kind of device or tool, a predictive tool, right, is a good tool. Okay. What is it that makes any tool, whether it's predictive or not, whether that's its job or not, good? And the answer is usefulness. Tools are good insofar as they are useful. And so James's theory of truth is sometimes said to be a usefulness theory, right? It's a theory according to which ideas are true insofar as they get a certain job done. Okay. Now, what is this job? I mean, different tools have different purposes. Not every tool has the same job. What's the job of an idea? Okay. James says again, ideas become true insofar as they help to get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. Okay. What is it to get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience, right? Well, clearly, right, given what we've already said about ideas according to pragmatists, one way of getting us into a satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience is to indicate to us now how future experience is going to go when we act in the world in certain ways. Okay? Ideas, in other words, get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. Again, when they just straightforwardly predict. Okay. So that's part of what James is saying about true ideas. He's saying they're predictive, right? Insofar as they are predictive, they get us into a satisfactory relationship with future experiences, right? Things go in the future, right, as we want them to go, instead of as how we do not want them to go. Ideas, though, also, according to James, get us into a satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience and in other ways, right? So we're not just looking, when we're looking for good ideas, for ideas that predict how things are going to go in the future. We should also like to get ideas that help us to make sense of how things have gone in the past. Okay. Specifically, we should like to have ideas that would have allowed us to predict how things in the past went ahead of time, right? Like if we had been in the past and were wondering about how things were going to unfold, right? So ideas, the true ideas, according to James, they allow us to accurately predict how things are going to go, and they also put us in a position to have predicted, had we been in the past, how things went. And that's sometimes called retrodiction. So true ideas, they're predictive, and they're retrodictive. Okay. What else is involved in an idea being true? What else is involved in getting us into a satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience? Well, it also seems to be the case that ease of prediction and retrodiction matters. Some ideas are like, in a way, they're like easier to use tools, right? You can imagine several different tools, all of which are supposed to do the same job, but one tool is just like especially like readily used to do that job. Okay, so ideas that allow us to predict or retrodict like more easily, right? More conveniently. Okay, that's more satisfying for us. Okay, and so that's also like a truth-making quality in an idea, right? Relative ease of application for predicting or for retrodictive purposes. Right? Disharmony among our ideas, or even conflict among our ideas, like that conflict between Augustinian idealism and voluntarism, which is also Augustinian. Conflict among our ideas is not satisfactory. After all, if there's conflict among the ideas, we're going to have like a conflict in expectations. If we have a conflict in expectations, it's not actually going to be clear like how we should act in order to like satisfy our desires and get the things we want. It's not going to be clear like what steps we should take in order to accomplish our goals, right? So we don't want that conflict among our ideas. So another like true making quality in an idea is that it harmonizes with like other ideas that we're already also committed to. Okay, and that leads to another true making quality of ideas, right? Another part of what James is getting at when he says that a true idea is an idea that helps get us into a satisfactory relationship with the parts of our experience. Right, we should also like ideas to allow us to come to agreement with other human beings, right? right? We want our ideas to allow us to come to agreement with other human beings because of course, like a lot of our action in this world is cooperative action. It's action undertaken with others, okay? If we do not agree with others, right? If we have like opposed ideas, right? It's going to be very difficult for us to act cooperatively in such a fashion as to achieve whatever goals we may have. And so, like another truth-making quality of an idea is that it allows for like agreement with the other human beings with whom we have to act. Okay. So let me now turn to this other part of what James is saying there. Ideas become true. Okay. James's view is that ideas typically emerge, new ones. They're invented. When putting into practice, applying the ideas we already have, we run into a problem. Like we find ourselves in some set of circumstances where the ideas that we've already got, like the theory, let's say like the theories that we already have, don't tell us one way or the other, like what's going to happen, right? They're indeterminate in this situation. Another possible problem, the ideas that we have going into a situation like prove not to work. I mean, they led us to have certain expectations about how things were going to go, and we acted in certain ways, and those expectations were then defeated. Things didn't go as expected, like at all. Okay, these are the occasions on which people tend to generate new ideas, right? When this occurs, though, James's view is we tend to be as conservative as we possibly can be. Okay, what he's getting at is that when we generate a new idea, even in the face of a failure of the ideas that we're already committed to, we try to change by adding this new idea as little about what we already believed as possible. Okay, so I mean, when our ideas or our theories prove to be indeterminate, or when like our theories fail, when tested experimentally, very often, right? People come up with, they invent like a number of new ideas, right? In order to like better deal with that kind of situation. The idea that tends to win out among all these competitors, that's the idea that allows us to hold on to retain as many of the ideas that we had before as possible. Okay, so we're James wants to say we're naturally conservative, like as thinkers, as idea perpetuators and inventors. And again, this makes sense given his understanding of what ideas are. Ideas are, again, they're tools of a certain kind. Okay, they're things that we have, that we invent and keep because they do certain jobs. Right, they're helpful to us. Okay, it makes sense then, right, when considering new ideas, which one to embrace in the face of some problem. It makes sense to accept that idea, which allows you to keep as many of these useful things that you've already got, like, as possible. Okay, so that anyway is the process by which an idea becomes true, right? We act in the world on the basis of the ideas that we've already got. We run into some kind of problem. We invent a number of candidate ideas to better address the problem. And we tend to select from among those candidates that idea which will allow us to retain as much of what we already believe as we can. Right. So now let me give you an example of this, and it's an example to which I refer in the slides presentation for this week, and it has to do with the Copernican revolution, it was called. And this is an intellectual revolution in which a long, very long-standing, widely accepted theory of the cosmos was replaced by a radically different theory, then proposed most famously by a Polish astronomer and mathematician named Copernicus. Okay. So prior to Copernicus, right, for actually thousands of years, intellectuals, at least in the West, had believed in what's called a geocentric theory of the cosmos. And this was a theory on which the Earth was the unmoved center of the cosmos as a whole. Everything else that moves in the cosmos was supposed to move around it, right? So Earth is at the center, everything else that moves around it. Moreover, everything else was supposed to move, I believe, at exactly the same speed, in the same direction, in perfect circles. Okay, so that's the scheme. This theory, this idea, was in fact an immensely useful idea. It allowed for the construction of like calendars, that's my understanding anyway, which could then be used to do a number of important things. I believe, among others, these calendars were used for agricultural purposes. They were used specifically to figure out when the appropriate time was for planting, right? Obviously, for agrarian societies, such as those in the Middle Ages and before, right? That makes this theory immensely useful, right? If it can help you make predictions about when to plant crops so as to get the most yield, right? That's an immensely useful theory. Okay. The theory could also be appealed to successfully in order to predict and explain after the fact, observable astronomical phenomena, right? The theory, as I've just explained it, was initially a very simple theory, right? Earth is stationary, everything else moves in perfect circles around it, in the same direction, at the same velocity. Very simple theory. Widely accepted among intellectuals, right? Anybody who's anyone accepts this theory, so easy to get agreement here. And also it was an idea that harmonized with other ideas that people have, particularly Christians, right? Who believed that of all of God's creations, right, the human being was the highest, right? God saved the best for last. Where in the cosmos would God put human beings if human beings are sort of the best, if indeed everything else in the cosmos has been created, right? Basically to make way for human beings. Don't you place your highest creation at the center of things? Surely you don't place right your highest creation in some obscure corner, right, of the cosmos. Surely it is in the center. Okay, and there are passages, I believe, in the Old Testament too, which refer to God doing things, very suggestive of geocentrism. Among other things, I think at one point in the Old Testament, in recounting a Bible, the chronicler states that God stopped the sun in the sky one day so that the battle could conclude successfully for basically God's people, the ancient Hebrews, right? If it says that God is stopping the sun in the sky, right? That's a strong indication that the sun had been moving. Okay. The theory started out as a very simple theory, but over time it became more and more and more complicated, and in part because observations were made of the heavenly bodies which seemed to be at odds with the theory. Okay. In particular, I believe it's the case that certain of the heavenly bodies, what we nowadays would call planets, some of them, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, they would appear to slow in their motion, stop, reverse direction, stop, change direction again, and continue on their way. Okay. So the theory, right, has certain practical consequences, leads us to expect certain things when we make observations of the heavenly body. The theory, in that instance, failed. The prediction was wrong. Okay? Again, according to the theory, everything other than the Earth moves in perfect circles, same direction, same speed. Okay. Right. What did they do in response to this predicted failure? Well, they introduced a new idea, and as you would expect, it was an idea that allowed them to retain as much of what they already believed as possible. And I believe this is the idea of the ellipses. An ellipsis is supposed to be it's a circle within a circle. Okay, so here is how they accounted for this failure of the original geocentric theory and improved it in order to take account of the new observations. Right? Their view was that yes, everything other than the Earth moves, and it moves in perfect circles at the same velocity in the same direction. But there are circles within circles. Right? So you can imagine like this being like a great circle that a planet travels. But their view was that the planets don't just travel great circles, at least some of them. The planets also travel smaller circles within the circle. And then back to the big circle. So I'll do that again. Okay. Now, how would this look? That part right there. If you were on Earth, right? So you're basically at the center of the circle. Right? How would that look? It would look like the planet stopped, reverse direction, stopped, and then reverse direction again. But of course it's not doing that. Actually, as it travels on the greater circle and the smaller circle, it's always traveling in a circle. In a sense, it's always traveling the same direction. It's always on the same path, right? Going the same way down that path, right? Think about it that way. And it's always moving at the same speed. It just doesn't look that way from our perspective. I'm sorry, it's not called an ellipsis, it's called an epicycle. It's called an epicycle. So that was an epicycle. Well, as time went on, they made more and more of these sorts of observations which ran contrary to what the original very simple geocentric theory would lead them to expect. And so what they had to do is they had to posit more and more and more and more of these epicycles. Okay. Eventually, the resulting theory became extremely unwieldy. You could still make like very accurate predictions about where the heavenly bodies would be months or years into the future, right? And so you could create like accurate calendars, and the crops would get planted on time, and so forth and so on. But right, as this theory became more complicated, right, with the positing of more and more epicycles, pardon me for ellipsis again, epicycles, these circles within circles, right, it became more and more costly to apply. This was one of the things that motivated Copernicus to try out a different theory, and that theory is a heliocentric theory. That's a theory on which the sun is at the center, right? and locally anyway, like in the local part of the cosmos, right? Things move, including the Earth, around it. And in Copernicus's system, like originally, like he held on to this notion that everything moves like at the same velocity and in the same direction in perfect circles, right? But of course, there's still a major change here, right? Rather than the Earth being stationary and everything moving around it, so it's the unmoved center, the sun becomes the center instead, and the Earth, right, moves around it. It's a huge change, intellectually revolutionary change. Okay, one of the main things this had going for it was simplicity, right? It turns out that like when you assume that the sun was at the center and the Earth moves around it, and everything else moves around it, the predictions became a lot easier, like mathematically, to make. True, I mean, the predictions which at first could be made were not quite as accurate as the predictions that could have been made on the latest, greatest geocentric theory. But they were a heck of a lot easier to make. Okay? This simplicity, right? It was viewed as like an extremely like attractive feature on the part of other intellectuals at the time. So this is like the Renaissance. It gradually became like widely accepted, and so the heliocentric theory, right, came to replace the geocentric theory. This didn't just occur though because it was simpler. It also occurred because Copernicus's idea was significantly improved upon, like not too long after his death, by other figures in the history of astronomy, such as Kepler, right, who of course held that actually the heavenly bodies, including the Earth, like they don't move in perfect circles, right? They move in elliptical orbits. Gradually, this theory of Copernicus's, this heliocentric theory, became just as, if not more, predictive, right, than the geocentric theory, and was also like simpler, much simpler to apply, right? And so that theory became accepted, the heliocentric theory, and the geocentric theory was rejected. Okay, and so that is meant to be like an example of what James is talking about here. Ideas becoming true insofar as they help to get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. Okay. So what I want to do in closing is make just a couple of criticisms of this theory. But before doing that, I want to pause to note like just how different what James is saying here from what Descartes wants to say about how knowledge is acquired. Because after all, like generating new, true ideas about the world, that's the acquisition of knowledge. Recall that according to Descartes, knowledge is supposed to be acquired by first radically doubting everything that you believe, right? Testing to see if there's any conceivable way that what seems to you to be true is actually false. Okay? When you do this, you're supposed to throw out any idea that you come across that could possibly be false when it seems true, and only accept those ideas, right, about which you cannot possibly be mistaken. Okay? Once you've got those, if you can find them, if you can find any of it at all, you're supposed to appeal to those to then generate like further ideas, which are also such that you cannot possibly be mistaken about them. Okay, you're supposed to do this also like completely individually, right? Like not in any kind of like cooperative effort or as a part of any cooperative effort with others. Right? This is not according to James, how new knowledge, is acquired. Okay. For one thing, right, we do not, according to James, in acquiring new knowledge, engage in Cartesian radical doubt. Okay. Indeed, I think James would say that that kind of doubt is actually absurd. Okay. I mean, yes, it is true. Doubt plays a role in the generation of new knowledge, but it's motivated doubt. It's doubt that we have when we find in the course of acting in the world that some of our ideas fail to some extent. Either again, they're not predictive, they're indeterminate, they don't tell us how things are going to go in a situation, or they made a prediction that turned out to be erroneous, what we expected on the basis of our ideas did not actually come to pass, right? So yes, I mean, doubt plays a role in the generation of new knowledge, but it's motivated doubt. Okay, it's not this kind of idle doubt where we just sort of wonder to ourselves, right? Is there any way that I could possibly be mistaken? If there's a deceiving God, right? Could this be false? When it seems to me to be true. Okay, James would also say, I believe, that it's absurd. Given what ideas are and what their job is, it's absurd to engage in that kind of radical doubt. And then when you find that you could possibly be mistaken about something, toss it out and move on, and no longer rely upon that idea, right? I mean, this would be a bit like somebody, right, finding from among all their tools, right, one tool that doesn't quite do the job that they want it to do. It'd be like that person systematically trying to break all of their tools, right? Like subjecting them to all kinds of stresses, right? Throwing out, right, all those that they find they can break, and only keeping the one or two tools that, try as they might, right, they just can't destroy. And then trying using those two remaining tools, let's say, to reconstruct a new toolbox, right? That's a ridiculous thing. That's a ridiculous thing to do, right? From James's perspective, ideas are tools, right? We have come to embrace some of them because they are useful to us. Okay, so it only makes sense to throw them out, right? When we have motivated doubt, because they've actually been proven to fail in practice. Okay, all right. Another difference between James's views on knowledge and Descartes' views of knowledge, those ideas that Descartes eventually sees, he can be certain of, recall that those were supposed to be foundational, right? These were supposed to be the beliefs which count as knowledge first of all. And by first of all, I mean these are the beliefs that count as knowledge that were supposed to support all the other beliefs that count as knowledge. They were supposed to provide evidence for all the other beliefs that count as knowledge without themselves, right, needing support from any other beliefs that count as knowledge, right? Those first certain ideas that we arrive at by this process of radical doubt, they're epistemic foundations. Okay. James's view is that there are no epistemic foundations, right? His view is in fact that everything that we know, right, everything that we come to know, we come to know on the basis of ideas that we already have. Okay. In James's view, right, knowledge is extended, right, always on the basis of other ideas to which we are already committed. Okay. And so James is a very good example of what is known in philosophy, specifically epistemology, as an anti-foundationalist. He's someone who does not think that there are foundations of knowledge. Okay. All right. Let me then turn finally to a couple of criticisms of the pragmatist theory of truth. Okay. And I want to make the first criticism by going back to that example that I gave of how it is that ideas become true, according to James, by getting us into a satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. So, the Copernican revolution. Okay. So, that's a revolution in which the idea of geocentrism was replaced by the idea of heliocentrism. And surely James would say, right, this is a process then in which the idea of heliocentrism becomes true. Okay, and the idea of geocentrism is falsified. Okay, so here's the question I want to ask as a way into this criticism. Before geocentrism was falsified, was it true? Like, in other words, like was geocentrism true, like, up until Copernicus? So, like, in the, 15th century, I think. And then after that, it was false, and heliocentrism was true instead. Is that right? Okay. I think one, based upon what James says in that lecture, there's a case to be made that that's his view. There's a case to be made for the claim that it's James's view that actually geocentrism was true, up until the Renaissance, and then it became false. And at that point, from that point on, right, heliocentrism was true. There's a case to be made. I mean, after all, like as I explained, geocentrism up until Copernicus got people into a very satisfactory relationship with other parts of their experience. It was predictive, it was retrodictive, it was consistent with other ideas that they had, it allowed for cooperation with other people. Originally, it was a rather simple idea, so easy to apply. Later on, it was more complicated to apply, but there were no competitors, so it was like the only game in town. So you don't really have much reason for complaint. It looks like, prior to Copernicus, it satisfies all the conditions which James lays out for an idea being true. So surely it was true, right? Only later on, when it became very, very unwieldy, and there was this simpler, ultimately equally predictive competitor, only then did it become false. Right? I mean, that's one way of reading what James has to say here about truth. And if that is in fact what James is saying about truth, his position is it's ridiculous. I mean, after all, there's a connection between our ideas of truth and our idea of reality, right? I mean, to say that something is true is to say, isn't it, that that's how things really are, right? I mean, if you ask someone, is what so-and-so saying true, right? They say, yeah, right? And you went on to ask, so that's how things really are, right? It would make no sense whatsoever for the other person to say, oh, things aren't really that way. I mean, that's true, but no, things aren't really that way. That makes no sense at all. So there's a connection between truth and reality. Okay, well, here's what this means, to go back to our example. If geocentrism was true up until the Renaissance, then it really was the case up until the Renaissance that the Earth was the unmoved center of the cosmos, and everything else in the cosmos that moved around it in perfect circles in the same direction at the same velocity. And it was only after Copernicus, right, that the cosmos completely changed. And the Earth, instead of being the unmoved center, really became something that moves around the sun. Right? Oh, and what brought about this change, this radical change in the nature of the cosmos? Oh, well, there was this Polish astronomer / mathematician who spilled some ink on paper and got other people to believe his theory. that changed the cosmos, right? So that whereas really it had been the case that the Earth was at the center, it became the case that really, right, the sun's at the center locally anyway, instead. Yeah, I don't think that that's a view that even really needs to be argued against, right? It's a ridiculous position to have. And so if James is committed to a theory of truth, right, on which geocentrism was ever true, right, he's committed to like a plainly ridiculous theory of truth, right? It's not a good theory. Okay. I do think that there is a way of saving his view, though, from this objection, and this way goes as follows. Okay, perhaps what James should have said and meant to say was this: not ideas become true simply insofar as they help get us into a satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience for a time. No, ideas become true, strictly speaking, insofar as they help get us into a satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience ultimately. Like at the end of the day, and by the end of the day I mean at the end of inquiry, for all the people who are inquirers about the subject matter in question, at the end of inquiry, at the very end, right? This is the last idea, right? This is the idea that was found to be like ultimately satisfactory for getting it, for as far as like relationships with other parts of our experience are concerned. Okay, that incidentally might very well have been James's view, even though it's not stated, I think, in that lecture. It might have been his view nonetheless, because I am pretty certain that it was another pragmatist's view, a pragmatist to whom James refers, and that's Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce had a very similar theory of truth, but so the true ideas are the useful ideas, but Peirce did not want to say like useful for a time, like up until the Renaissance, right? No, he wanted to say like ultimately. Okay, at the end of inquiry, right? The ideas that we ultimately settle on, those of us who inquire about this matter, those are the true ones. Those are the true ones. Okay. In any case, if that's James's unstated view, at least in that lecture, then he's saved from this objection, because on that reading of James, geocentrism actually never would have been true. It would have been believed true, but would not actually have ever been true. It instead always would have been false, but merely believed true for a time, albeit like a very, 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 very long one. Okay, so one last criticism of James and his theory of truth before concluding this already long lecture. It seems as though this is not really a theory of truth at all. Actually, it seems more like, at best, it's a theory of knowledge. Okay. Let me get at why it seems this way, or why it might seem this way to some people. Look, surely there are some truths that are not known. Yeah. And these truths also that are not presently known, they will never be known. They will never be known. Okay? So these truths that are not known and never will be known, they cannot possibly ever actually become ideas that help to get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. No. Okay. What are some examples of such truths? Okay. I'm going to give you a relatively trivial one, but I think it's one that will at least make the point pretty well. So I assume everyone is familiar with this figure from history, Julius Caesar. There really was such a person. He was assassinated like in the first century BCE still, so before the common era. I do not think, while he was bald, I do not think he was radically hairless. That is, I think even at the time of his death, right, there were some number of hairs on his body. Whatever that number was, if it's some number, it's either odd or even, right? One or the other is true. Okay, which is it? We don't know. Will we ever know? Will one or the other of these ideas ever get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience? No. I mean, the answer is no. There's something that's true here that will never be known, and will certainly never help get us into a more satisfactory relationship with other parts of our experience. Okay, if there are ideas like that, like even one, okay, then James's theory of truth is not actually a good theory. Okay, so this objection that I'm making has to do with basically unknown truths. Okay, and so at best, James's theory, you could say, is a theory about good theory about known truths, right? It's a theory about how it is that truths become known. And I think I want to end the lecture here. And so that is all for this time.